the previous Amud, and then Amalei Reb Chia Larav. So Reb Chia, for those of you that enjoy Talmudic mishpachology, Reb Chia was the uncle of Rav. Reb Chia was a contemporary of Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So Reb Chia, we normally think of him as a Tanna, and Rav, we normally think of him as the first generation of Amoraim, but Rav has super status. Rav is called Rav Tanna Upalig. So Rav is that moment where the Amoraim begin, and he has it isn't the generations and the walls of different kufas don't just change like a mathematical equation, but rather there's like a generational switchover, and Rav was, so to speak, that in between, that he is the first Amora, but he can naturally raise his status to that of a Tanna. He learned in Siperi under Rav Yehuda Hanasi in Eretz Yisrael, and then he moved to Bavel. He opened up his own academy, which very, very quickly became the biggest yeshiva in Bavel. That is the rest of the history that we don't really need to know. We just need to know that Reb Chia is telling Rav a little bit of Musar. He's telling a little bit of Musar, and it's just fascinating because this Gemara began with a question that Rav asked Rabbi. So you have a question, an unusual situation that happens in a few cases in Shas. You have an unusual situation where an Amora is asking a question to a Tanna. Rav is asking Rav Yehuda Hanasi. And what's the question? Amalei Reb Chia Rav Bar Pachsi. So look at Rashi over here. He gives him a accolade and calls him Ben Gedolim. Bar Pachsi. He calls him Ben Gedolim. There's a Rabbi Kiva Ega little tzion over here. The word Bar Pachsi literally means the son of great people. Rabbi Kiva Ega in his Chidushim on Shabbos gives us some more information. He quotes a few psukim. One of them I wrote down in my notes over here. It's a pasuk in Chagai, Zerubbabel Pachas Yehuda. So the word Pachas is basically like a leader. I'm wondering, we know that in Persian there's a word called a pasha, and the word cha and sha could possibly be interchangeable. So like a pasha is a Arabic Persian warlord or leader. So a word pachas over here means Bar Pachsi, you are the child of Gedolim. Now, what's interesting is that the word Bar Pachsi appears in a few places in Shas. In the other places, for example, in Nazir, the word Bar Pachsi, Rashi says something slightly different. Rashi says, B'nai shel Talmud Chacham. You are the son of a Talmud Chacham. Your father was the royalty. Rav's father is called in some places in Shas Aboy. I think maybe Aboy means like the word Av, like the father of Rav. Aboy was his name. And in other places in Shas, Bar Pachsi means you're the son of an Adam Gadol. But here, when it says Ben Gedolim, it's mashma that he is the child of a lineage of Gedolim. And it happens to be that in Ksuvas Samach Beis Amud Beis, in Ksuvas Samach Beis Amud Beis, we find out that Rav Yehuda Hanasi comes from the brother of, Rav Yehuda Hanasi himself, of course, comes from David HaMelech. He's one of the Nasiim. He's the last Nasi, big Nasi in Eretz Yisrael. And Rav himself comes from Shimi. Shimi is the brother of David HaMelech. So David HaMelech had a brother called Shimi. From Shimi comes Rav, and from David HaMelech comes Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So the word Ben Gedolim means that they are like from lineage. Reb Nati asks, is it possible that it's also related to Pachas, like Pachas Kamayim? The Pachas in that context, as far as I know, means you are quick to action, from the word pchizos, quick to action. If I understand correctly, it's a negative term in that sense. I'm not sure. Can I just be very, very honest with you? My research on Rav Yehuda Hanasi and Rav comes from cheating. Oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. This book is probably older than some of you. You probably remember it from some library somewhere, from Yavne to Pumbedisa. I looked this up this afternoon. I got a whole ton of Mara Makomos. I want you to, hi Rav Nati, okay, give a whole bunch of Mara Makomos over here of this little kufa. I wasn't even planning on giving share on this. I was planning on giving share. My share is very complicated. The second thing, but I just found this situation so incredibly fascinating. I wanted to speak it out. So let's read the Gemara weiter. Amalei Rav Chia Larav Bar Pachsi. You, a person who comes from a whole lineage of royalty, of great people. Loya Minilach. Did I not teach you? Kikai Rebbe Bahamasachta. That when Rebbe is learning in one Masechta, Loi Tishalehu b'Masechta Achrise. Do not ask him on another Masechta. Dilma Lava Daite. Ha! Okay, maybe his mind is not focused on the answer. Dilab the Rebbe Gavra Rabbahu. If it wasn't for the fact that Rebbe is a Superman, a Gavra Rabba, Havi Kasafte. You could have possibly embarrassed him. The Mishanilach Shinuye Dulav Shinuye. He could have possibly answered you on a sugya that he's not really holding in. Holding in is a Yiddish term, right? You know, he wasn't holding in the sugya. Hashtemiya Shapi Mishanilach. But in this particular case, where Rav Yehuda Hanasi first of all gave you an answer, and then sent you on a tangent by talking about the status of a hand in Haitzah, the Mishanilach Shinuye, Baruch Hashem, the story has a happy ending. Rav Chia says, why Hashtemiya Shapim Mishanilach? The Tanya, and then Rav Chia brings a brisa to support Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So Rav Yehuda Hanasi gave you a good answer, and the story has a happy ending. So, I mean, I promise you, if we were learning Daf Yomi, we wouldn't spend more than 10 seconds on this. Rav Chia is coming along and saying to Rav, he says, you're a lucky person because you did something very bad. You did something very wrong. You asked a Rav a question on a sugya that he was not holding in, and luckily that the person that you picked on happens to be called Rav Yehuda Hanasi, and luckily for us, Rav Yehuda Hanasi was able to give you an answer, and I'll prove it to you because I will bring you now a brisa that backs Rebbe, which is of course in itself funny because Rebbe doesn't need anyone to back him. He's Rebbe, like he makes the big bucks. He's Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So just before I start asking all my questions on this sugya, you should be asking these questions. You should be typing out questions of what is going on over here. Before I ask all my questions, I'm going to skip to the end of my notes to tell you what the halacha is. Just you should know what the halacha is, just to know the story, how it ends. This is halacha l'maisa. The Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah. This is something that once every 2 years or so, every person should chazer over and learn. It's very much halacha l'maisa, Hilchos Talmud Torah of the Rambam. It's full of yisaidis. It's not just halacha, it's instant musar. But there, Hilchos Talmud Torah, Perek Daled, halacha vav, the Rambam says, ve'ein shoylim es harav mi'inyan echad ele ma'oise inyan shu asukim by kedei shelo yizbayesh. Never ask a rabbi on a sugya that is not the sugya that he's learning, because you may end up embarrassing him. That is in halacha vav. Halacha zayin, he says almost identical words. Ve'ein shoylim es harav ele ba'oise inyan shein kairin boy, says the Kesef Mishnah, and the Lechem Mishnah, the shame of the Marik. He says you should just know that the inyan of this double language in halacha vav and halacha zayin is to teach you that not just you shouldn't ask a person the example of the Kesef Mishnah, which is of course the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber. You shouldn't just not ask him, you're learning Hilchos Shabbos, and ask him from Hilchos Yom Tov. But even in Hilchos Shabbos, if you're learning, says the Kesef Mishnah, if you're learning the laws of Haitzah, which is what we're learning over here, you shouldn't ask him from another sugya in Maseches Shabbos. So even in the Masechta itself, you cannot ask from one sugya to another sugya. That's how the Rambam paskins la halacha. But the questions that we have over here is very, very obvious. First of all, just wanted to show you the top Rashi. Rashi says, Leite shalayhu, don't ask a question. Klaima. Klaima means what's going on behind the scenes. Shein liboy lemesachtazu b'shemi yizbayish. Shein liboy b'mesachtazu shemi yizbayish. Why doesn't Rashi say shein daitoi lemesachtazu? Why does he mean shein liboy lemesachtazu? His heart is not in the Masechta. He didn't. We should say his intellect. He doesn't have the information. So hold this in your short-term memory. I want to ask a bunch of obvious questions. The most obvious question, which is like to the point of being bizarre, is that Rav Chia is saying, "How dare you ask Rav Yehuda Hanasi from another Masechta?" This is like shocking. This is like absolutely shocking. Let's just step back for a moment and talk about Gedolim and Tzaddikim. I just, again, I'm a Talmud of Rav Moshe Shapiro, Tzaddik Zichron Livracha. Rav Moshe Shapiro was a person who literally, when I say he knew Kol HaTorah Kulei, I know for a fact that he knew Shas with the major Rishonim by heart. In other words, you could start him off on a Rosh or a Ram or a Ramban on any part of Shas, and he could tell you basically Tzamtzis Hadvarim. And when it comes to the words of Shas itself, you start him off on any page of Shas, and he could have finished it for you. In the last years of his life, he told someone who wrote this down. He said it over in one of the Hespedim. He told someone that I knew that I had a brain tumor because I realized that I did no longer had a total shlita on Shas. That's how I knew that I had a brain tumor. When he had his operation on his brain tumor, there were Adim over there that saw this. A lot of people were there when this happened. When he came out of the operation room, the first thing he asked was some private time with his Talmidim, and he asked them to ask him questions on any place on Shas, and then also on any place in the Zohar and any place in the Eitz Chaim of the Arizal, just to ask him basic questions. He wanted to make sure that after the operation that his memory was still there. I was told that everyone was embarrassed to ask him questions, so he said, "Come back in an hour. I'll ask the questions to myself." And after an hour, he came back, and Baruch Hashem, he was happy that he still was able to be sure on these things. I'm not gonna say that my Rebbe, okay, this Rebbe over here that I have in front of me, I'm not going to say that I'm embarrassing him if I say that he doesn't hold a candle on Rebbe Yashiv. Rav Moshe Halberstam, as you all know, was one of the Gedolim of the Badats. Rav Moshe Halberstam said about Rebbe Yashiv, the difference between me and you, and the example that Rav Moshe Halberstam said, he says, if I would ask you, if I would say, what is the pasuk before, and then let's say, Karav Hashem l'chol karev l'chol asher yikru b'emes. What is the pasuk beforehand? Just to be honest, how do you work? You say Karav is the letter Kuf. Before Kuf becomes Tzadik. Tzadik Hashem b'chol deracho. That's how we memorize things. He says, Rebbe Yashiv doesn't work that way. He says, for me, I have a system how I know all the Shulchan Aruch and all the Neisei Kalim. I have a system to memorize him. Rebbe Yashiv does not have a system. He has it in front of him exactly the same way that I would have in front of me I'd have my Mishnah Berurah. I open it up and I read, so he can do exactly the same, but he doesn't have to go through the technicalities of opening things up. The people, the Briskers did not like him. The Briskers used to come around and chepper him in Hilchas Shabbos and Hilchas Place. Once there was a story that one Brisker came in and asked him on a very obscure Rishon that no one's heard about. So Rabbi Yasha was fed up and turned to him and says, listen, tell me how many times does this obscure Rishon appear in all of Shulchan Aruch and in all the Torah? So the guy says, well, he says, well, I know. So if you want to pick on me, so just know who you're picking on. I'm just telling you, there's a rare example where Rabbi Yashiv showed a little teeny weeny bit of gaiva. But these are all people that I knew. I used to go to Rabbi Yashiv all the time. I was a Talmud of Moshe for Baruch Hashem for over 30 years. And these people were nobody compared to the early generations. Do I lose my place in Olam Haba? If I said Rav Yehuda Hanasi probably knew more than the Gra, right? Just think about that. He probably was Shalit more than the Vilna Gaon. So here we have over here where Rav, who was the future teacher of all of Klal Yisrael, is getting Musar from his uncle, Reb Chia. And Reb Chia says to him, how dare you ask him a question in one Masechta? And it could be he's not holding. And we see over here that the Oimek is Lav Dafka Masechta, even in a different sugya. You can't even switch sugyas on your Rebbe. So I just want to, I'm going to be sharing with you, by the way, by telling you where I'm going with this whole thing. I'm going to be sharing with you in about 5 minutes a idea from Rav Hutner, and it is like mind-blowing. It is so powerful. So that's really my agenda over here. But before we do that, just a few more questions over here. There's a Gemara in Shabbos Kufya Dalet, Amud Al. It's actually, it's right in front of you. The Gemara in Shabbos Kufya Dalet brings down the following statement. Amor Rabbi Yechanan, Ezu Talmud Chacham. Define a Talmud Chacham. Shemamanim Oisa Parnas Al Tzibur, that you can make him a Parnas, a leader on your community. Zeh Sheshoyim Oisai, Dvar Halacha B'Kol Makayim, V'Ama Afilu B'Meseches Kala. You can ask him a question in any possible place. V'Afilu B'Meseches Kala. Okay, so let's say, imagine you're living in a place called Kansas City, or Ottawa, or in a place called Houston, Texas, or you're in Savannah, Georgia. I'm not going to say Chicago, okay, because there you have Talmidei Chachamim that can do this. But the rest, I'm just teasing. I'm saying you want to parnas al tzibur, so this should be the criteria. You want to become Rav in the BMCH shul in Kansas City. So all you have to do is be sure that you could be asked in any place, afilu Meseches Kala, which if you've never learned Meseches Kala in your life, nothing to be embarrassed about, because it's an example of something that's super obscure. So that is what you need over here. So all the Achronim asked the question over here. If you're supposed to be sholet on everything, so what is going on over here? Why are we suddenly getting upset? Why is Reb Chia getting upset for asking a question on another Masechta? We're talking about Rav Yehuda Hanasi over here. I just had to throw this in, a story that I happen to like because I'm British. It's one of the stories that they say over in England. England had a great rabbi who actually became famous because of his farm when he moved to Bayit Pagan, Rav Chatzkel Abramsky. Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was the chief rabbi of England. He was once called to the courts of England. About an issue. I couldn't remember this. There's a whole story behind why he had come along. If I'm not mistaken, it was one of those stories where the London Beis Din was being attacked by its own rabbiner in certain legal matters, so he had to defend. He's the one, Rav Chatzkel Abramsky, that made the London Beis Din a stempel of kashrus. Then it was sort of hovering and being conservative. Remember, we're talking about like 100 years ago when YU was very left-wing, almost conservative. So in England, you had United Synagogue was almost, that kind of thing. So Rav Chatzkel Abramsky brought it to the mainstream, and he had to give testimony in front of the British judges with their white wigs. And before they asked him, he said, "Is it true what they say about you, that you are the master of all of Jewish law?" So Rav Chatzkel Abramsky gets up and he says, "I know everything there is on Jewish law, and Jewish Talmud, on Jewish Midrash, on Jewish mysticism, on Jewish everything. I know everything by heart." So the guy with the big wig says to him, "1 second, sir." He says, "I always thought that great rabbis are supposed to be humble. You don't sound like to me that you're a very humble person." And Rav Chatzkel Abramsky says, "You are right, my honor. It is not a humble statement, but what should I do? I'm on oath." right? I'm on oath, so I have to tell the truth. So that's how these people were over here. So that's the way you have a parnas on a tzibur. So what exactly is different over here? Another thing that's not 100% clear, these next two questions will be easily fixed up, is the way that Rav Chia gives Musa to Rav. He starts up and says to him, do not embarrass this person, because maybe he will not know the answer to your question. So the Achronim, a lot of Achronim ask the same question, and they say, maybe he will not know the right answer. So there's a much bigger problem over here. The bigger problem is why doesn't he say is maybe he will give the wrong answer? If he gives the wrong answer, so then you're in real trouble, because we're talking about Hilchos Shabbos. We're talking about being over Iser Skila B'Shegeg, because the Rav paskened wrongly. And if you're asking someone where he's not holding and he gives a quick answer, so you could really, really have a much bigger problem over here, that he will answer your question and say the wrong thing. So why didn't Rav Chia say that, forget about the problem of Busha? There's a huge problem that he may accidentally pasken the wrong way. Another very similar question is, at the end he says, but you're lucky, because we're talking about Rav Yehuda Hanasi, and Rav Yehuda Hanasi knows everything, so everything's going to be beautiful, everything's going to fall into place, because it happens to be that a man of his stature can be asked on absolutely everything, and he's instantly holding. And then the fourth question, which I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked, because no one cares about these questions except for Menachem Nissel, and that is, why is this back and forth in the middle of the sugya of Malacha Gerua, and it's between these two giants, the greatest Tanna, really the last generation of the great Tanna that compiled the Mishnah, and the great Talmud that built Torah in Bavel. He was the one, together with Shmuel, but in the end he was much more successful than Shmuel. He built this massive yeshiva with thousands of Talmidim from all over Bavel that would come to learn Torah from him. This discussion is happening between the two of them, Dafka, in the middle of the sugya of Malacha Gerua, over here in Shabbos, talking about hands and bodies and shoulders, and discussing about going from one rishus to the other rishus. So I have a sefer over here that my son bought this for me in the, you remember that place next to the mirror, that little bookstore? It's called Ha'aros in Masechah Shabbos. It's Rebbe Yashiv's Shiurim on Shabbos over here. The truth of the matter is, a little secret, I opened it today for the first time, because I'm sort of, when I don't instinctivthis look for Rebbe Yashiv to understand Lomdus. I look for Rebbe Yashiv when I see things have halachic issues. And this is, this happened to be, I opened it up and I saw that he's very bothered. He's the only person I found that's very bothered by the top 6 lines of Gimel Amud Beis. And he brings down the following thing. He asks the same question that we just asked. He says, if a rabbi has all the answers, what are you so worried about? So he answers the following thing. He says, it's not obvious that he will be able to give an instant answer. And since you're asking him a question and he doesn't have an instant answer, he'll be embarrassed that that little lag of time shows that he's not completely mastering like Rebbe Yashiv style. It's funny because Rebbe Yashiv is the one talking over here. He's not instantly holding. That lag of time, says the Rebbe Yashiv, that's the busha that we're talking about here in the sugya. Now, I just want to point out over here that what Rebbe Yashiv has answered over here is one of the questions that I was saying, what's the issue? Is it lack of knowledge? Is it paskening wrong? He says, no, that whole line that Rav Chia says, you're lucky we're talking about Rav Yehuda Hanasi, that he doesn't have this problem, because what is really happening over here, this is not a sugya in Hilchos Psak Halacha. This is not a sugya that we're worried we're going to come out with the wrong halacha. This is a sugya in Hilchos Kavod Rav, because when a Rav answers a question and there's a time lag, there's the possibility that you will be Mabayish himself. You'll be Mabayish this person. At the end of this little shtickle over here, Rabbi Yashiv says, in 2020, we don't have these problems anymore. He says, he writes at the end, today, unfortunately, Rabbanim don't have this sensitivity to Busha. And he also says that Bepashtus, this is Rabbi Yashiv speaking, you don't have to agree, is Bepashtus, this whole thing about Busha is only when this thing is happening barabim. It's a bit of a chiddush. He's saying if it's just the two of you, when we used to go to Rabbi Yashiv with our questions, if he doesn't have the answer straight away, no. But if it's a public thing and everyone sees he didn't have the answer instantly, so that is today not a busha, because Rabbanim today don't have that sensitivity, but in those days was considered a busha. The Chasam Sofer has a bunch of answers, which I just saw in the Mara Makoma says a bunch of answers, but he says over here that the busha is really a code word for something else. He has difficulty in thinking the whole thing about busha. He quotes the Gemara, Rabbi Hanasi shall call Yisrael, or Yemais Yeshua ad Rabbi le'metzina Torah gedula b'makam echad. This is the Gemara in Gittin of Nun Tes. We never saw since Moshe Rabbeinu a man that was the Melech and was Torah in one person. He says that the risk of the pause, the risk of the time lag, was not so much the busha itself, but rather you're being matriach the Rav to waste his time. Meaning, when you're not holding in the sugya, so for you it's a shtickle bittel Torah on your level. This is the Chasam Sofer. Obviously, the Chasam Sofer once again is paskening this idea very, 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 very much autobiographically, because the Chasam Sofer also, you could ask him any way you want on everything. He knew kol Torah kula by heart, and he probably did not like it when people shepherded him in the middle of shir and they asked him tangential things that were not connected to the Masechta. Now, let's go back to the question that all the Achronim ask, and that is that our Gemara, our Sugya, contradicts seemingly the Gemara in Kuf Yud Daled. There it says, if you want to be Rav of a community, you must be Shelet on everything. Rabbi Yashiv says the definition of everything to be a Rav, in his words, is Shas and Paskim. All you have to know is Shas, it's not what he says, is Shulchan Aruch and its Neisei Kelim. I beg your pardon. All you have to know is Shulchan Aruch and the Neisei Kelim. Shulchan Aruch and Neisei Kelim means not just Aruch Chaim, means Even HaEzer and Cheshim Mishpat and Yair Dea with every single Shachan Taz, with every single Kseis and the Sivas. You have to be able to master that to become the Rav of Kansas City, to become the Rav of Ottawa, to become the Rav of the Heilige Houston of Savannah. This is how he paskins the halacha. Now, the Gilyoni Shas is throughout this Masechta is Rav Yosef Engel, not to be confused with the Gilyon Hashas, which is Rabbi Kiva Ega. The Gilyoni Shas is Rav Yosef Engel. He says the following words. He says is that there's a fundamental difference between Bavadai Pesach Yidea Kalatera Rakshu Shakua Bilimudai Ad Shiyetze Miyunai Yizbayish. So he says the following thing. He says, we're not talking about a person's knowledge. We're talking about when a person is Shakua, when a person is and a person is involved in one sugya. So when a person's inside a sugya, then you have to mentally step out and enter into another sugya. So that is what he felt was the problem over here. He says, we're not talking about a person who is accepting shilas, he's not holding any sugya, he asks from here, he asks from here. We're not talking about, we're talking about a person that's in the middle of the sugya. So that's where the problems begin. Rabbi Yashiv says the Gemara Kuf Yud Daled does not sound like Rabbi Yosef Engel. Rabbi Yosef Engel seems to be making up his own chakiras. Rabbi Yashiv says there's a much simpler answer, which makes a lot of sense to you and me, and that is there's a fundamental difference between a halachic question and a Lomdus question. And here we're getting to what I want to talk about over here is that Lomdus is extremely subtle. Halacha is really turning your brain into a computer. A person who is halachically organized can answer questions on Kala Torah Kulei. A person has to have a good memory and has to be extremely organized. A person with Lomdus, it's a whole different avodah. And when a person's in a sugya, you can't ask him on another sugya. This is what Rabbi Yashiv says. I have to share with you a personal story, and I remember this so clearly because I was very emotional. When I was living and learning in my yeshiva, I was right next to with Rosh Yeshiva. We were very close to Rav Steinberg. It was very easy to go into Rav Steinberg on 2 Panami Eras, climb up the stairs, go in and ask him a question. So I caught once Rav Steinberg, and he sort of knew me. He's the main pesach for my Sefer Rigshei Lev. So if you have a look in my introduction to the Sefer, I say that every time I write a psak and I don't say who it is, it's always the default is always going to be Rav Yashiv. So excuse me, Rav Steinberg. So I went to Rav Steinberg and his older age, and he said to me, the question you ask, you can only ask me now questions on halacha, what to do. You can't ask me any questions in Lomdus. What he was telling me that his brain was no longer working in the last years of his life. It was very sad, but he had that clarity that he could say over to someone ask a question, do not ask me Lomdus, you can only ask me questions in halacha. So now I get to Rav Hutner, because I want to share this with you. The Dava Mavhil, it's an Aimek, it's a tremendous Aimek that Rav Hutner says. Rav Hutner, as you all know, the Sfarm that he has is the Pachad Yitzchak, and the Pachad Yitzchak on Shavuos, Maimer Tes, says the following. I'm going to read it to you. Azhara, this warning of Hashelu b'Meseches Acheres is kasher. One second, just want to take some reading glasses. Sorry about this middle-aged moment. Right. Ba lahadgish es tzad hagadlus shel hanishal. He says something over here which is kind of like incredible. He says this whole sugya brings out not the weakness of the person that's being asked, but the greatness of the person that's being asked. Hainu, shedafka gadlusa shel adam hi hamachayeves hishtakus gemura umechletes b'mesecheshu aymebai ad kedei shlilas efsharus hatshuva b'meseches acheres. So he says the following incredible thing. He says, when you are a super gadol, not just a gadol, a super gadol, and somebody asks you in a sugya, so your challenge is to switch off every other mesachta so that you're super focused on that thing alone. Adarabba, ad kama shetuchasem midas gadol shel harav, keinu umezeh yiktan chayme azhara. So he says, the greater you are, the more you have to switch off everything else. So this is something that just it's in general, you need to think about what exactly means to block things off. Reb Chaim Ozer, when he used to, Reb Chaim Ozer, as you all know, trained himself, his brain could think about 3 different things simultaneously. People tested him on this. You'd have 2 people asking him questions at the same time, complicated questions, and then he would answer Reuben and then answer Shimon. And while he was answering Reuben and Shimon, he would interrupt his wife, who was speaking to the neighbor. This story was told over by Rav Dessler. Rav Dessler once came in with a very difficult communal question that he had to ask. I heard this from Rav Moshe Shapiro. Rav Dessler, his rabbi, came in. So you heard this. Rav Dessler came in, and it was in his breakfast room. And he only had one room. His wife was talking to a neighbor, and while he was talking, he says to Rav Dessler, do you mind if I'm being rude that while you're talking, I'm flipping pages? I just got this incredible sefer from Rav Shimon Shkop. I just got a sefer from Rav Shimon Shkop, and he's flipping pages while Rav Dessler is talking about a communal issue. He couldn't believe it. And then he just stops Rav Dessler. He turns to his wife, interrupts his wife with the conversation she's having with her shchenta. He says, no, you're quoting something incorrectly. And it's like, he said, it's not normal. These people are not normal. So when Rav Chaim Isaac Grodzinski used to daven, so he davened very, very quick tefillos, like massively quick tefillos. And when he finished, his faces was always had blotches on them. The blood was drawn. And he said over, because I trained myself my whole life to be thinking in different things at the same time. But when it comes to tefillah, it is forbidden to think about anything except for the words you're saying that you're talking to Hashem. It's unnatural for me. So I have to take my brain and do something different with it. That's what Rav Hutner is talking about, is the avodah that a person is focusing on one mesechta to the exclusion of everything else. If he wants to say the right thing, he has to switch out everything, close his mind. Today, the greatest CD-ROM on the planet, the person with the most knowledge on the planet, is by far Rav Chaim Kanievsky. All the stories of Rav Chaim Kanievsky are all a little freaky about how, whatever, Yeshiva Baruch would come in and play this game. How many times does this name appear? And then they would say, well, the CD, the what's it called, the computer says differently. And Rav Chaim Kanievsky said the computer is wrong because the computer doesn't realize that sometimes that word means something else. And he would go through it throughout Shas. Rav Chaim Kanievsky, when he was a child, trained himself not to put in his head anything that wasn't Torah. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky doesn't know anything about the world. It's a bit of a problem. This is good enough for now. But Rav Chaim Kanievsky trained himself that if you, I think the story was he had not heard of Toronto. Whatever, say had not heard of Toronto. If he did anything, it's not. Again, he had heard of Gibraltar, because Gibraltar is where the suffix of where you see the bracha She'asas Yom HaGadol happens, because that's where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean. So he knew about Gibraltar because it has a halachic implication, but Toronto he had not heard of. The bottom line is that now I have over here from the Sefer Zichron Maskil Yehuda, I don't know who that is, on page 200, that the Bachram asked Rav Hutner privately that your mimer in Shavuos, your mimer in Shavuos, it doesn't really fit in, because Rav Chia says that Baruch Hashem, that we're talking about Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was capable of answering on other mesechtas as well. So it doesn't seem to fit in with your var. And Rav Hutner said, no, that's exactly my var. That's what Rav Chia was saying. He's saying, Rav Chia was saying to Rav, generally speaking, when you're talking about Gedolei Yisrael, you're not allowed to ask them in every mesechta, because when they're holding in a mesechta, and now we're going to understand that when we see a holding mesechta, it means not halacha. We're talking about Lomdus. We're learning the Lomdus of a mesechta. So they actively switch off everything else in Kol HaTorah Kulo. So they're not holding anywhere else. So they're super focused on the Lomdus hand. That is a simon of true greatness. And it's true with every human being throughout history, including the Vilna Gaon, including Rashi, but not Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was so Torah v'Gedula b'makam echad that he did not need to do this. That's the chiddush of Rav Chia, that you should just know how great Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was. So with this in mind, I want to say my own chiddush. I want to say my own thought over here, if that's okay. I want to share with you how I understand why this sugya is happening over here. You and I have no idea how seismatic, I think that's the right word, this tkufa was of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi going over to Rav. Because Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as you all know, he redacted the Mishnayos. He was the last of the great Tanoim. He was the last great Tanna. Everything that came out of the words of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi became the Torah of Klal Yisrael for the next 2,000 years. The word Tanna means the teacher. The word Amora is the one that gives it over. I want to make this even more dramatic. Rav lived in the year 4,000. So this whole story was happening. It could be. I'm making up just for drama. I have no proof of this. This conversation between Rav Yehuda Hanasi and Rav could have happened in the year 4,000. As you all know, the Gemara brings down that the world is divided into three kufas. 6,000 years is Olam Hazeh. The first 2,000 is called Toihu. The next 2,000 is called Torah. And the last 2,000 is called Yomos HaMashiach. The Gra writes that the 2,000 years of Yomos HaMashiach is the 2,000 years of returning to Toihu, but instead of preparing for the 2,000 years of Torah, like you all learned in this week's parsha, that Avram was different from Noach, because Noach was 10 generations, and he didn't get the schar. He ended up having the mabul. But Avram Avinu had 10 generations. It's the Mishnah in Perek Hay, the very beginning of Perek Hay of Avos. And Kibel Schar Kulam means because Avram was the anchor from the 2,000 years of Torah of Toihu into the year of Torah, which means that the 2,000 years of Toihu were not wasted. They became the raw material that broke into the 2,000 years of Torah. Rashi brings down, I think it's in Avodah Zarah, Rashi brings down in the year 2000 is when Avraham Avinu started to teach Torah. So for all of us, everyone over here, Baruch Hashem is in Chinuch, Torah only becomes Torah when it's passed on. So Avraham Avinu took the 2,000 years of Toihu and anchored it into the 2,000 years of Torah, and therefore he gets the schar for the 2,000 years. Rebbe is passing over 2,000 years of Torah into the 2,000 years which the Gra calls the Toihu before Mashiach comes. So in practice, it means 2,000 years of Galus. It means 2,000 years of Talmud Bavli. Talmud Bavli is a Galustika Torah that's built on the clarity of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It's built on the zach, on the clarity. Every word that comes out of Rav Yehuda Hanasi's mouth is Torah l'deiros. It's Torah that has to exist forever and ever and ever. So now I think that the shiurim, the first two shiurim that I gave you on Masechah Shabbos, on Malacha Grua, and we said the following thing: this parak is cowboy country. The Masechta begins with Malacha Grua because it is the only one of the 39 malachas that when you ask yourself, how do we anchor it into the history of the Mishkan? We don't know. The sugya drives you crazy. The first parak of Shabbos should be learned together with parak Hazarik and certain chunks of Erevin, and it's basically spurious. The rules are very spurious, especially I purposely avoid talking about throwing things, because throwing things is a different Lomdus. Was focusing just going from Rishus to Rishus. Last week we learned the Reb Chaim about Dalad Amos and Rishus HaRabim. Like, whoa, it's a whole different Lomdus. It's a whole different way of understanding, and that could have happened in the Mishkan. We don't know, and that is a tola of the Av, which is Hitzah, and it has a different way of looking at it. So Malacha Grua is when if you're asking a fundamental question, be'ion, Lomdus, not halacha, not something that Rabbi Hanasi, how do you paskin? No, we're talking about what is the status of a hand. What is the status of a hand in Hitzah? There's no precedent. It's not in the Beis HaMedrash. It's not like he can say, oh, Rabbi Kiva said this, Rabbi Yochanan Mizah. These things over here are being asked for the first time, and they're being transported into the world of the Amoraim, lenetzach, netzachim, until the end of time. So here Reb Chia comes along and says to his nephew, you cannot do that. You cannot do that. It just happens to be, as Rav Hutner explains, that you're lucky that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is big enough than that. But you cannot do that because it's so big what you're doing. It's so important what you're doing. There is a small possibility that you will transgress the terrible avera of being mevayish the gadol hador. And I want to add the following thing. I believe, again, this is Libi Aimeli, that's why the sugya begins with saying, Rav Chia says to him, you know who you are? You come from godless. You come from greatness. You know he's Torah v'gedula b'makom echad. He comes from David HaMelech, and he's the God Ladar, like the Rambam says in the Shemona Prakim. That was a throwback to earlier Dairis. No one in the generation of Rabbi ever argued with him. He was a throwback to earlier generation. He was godless and things. So you're doing something that you're asking him to take a sugya like Hitzah, which is a malacha gerua, and you ask him a Lomdus question that will have ripple effects in the world of halacha, all the way to Rav Nachum Zemba in Teitzos Chaim, and all the way to the Avnei Nezer, and to the end of time. So he says, you can't do that, because maybe, according to the Pashtus, you'll be Mavayashim because he'll have to wait a second, or maybe the Avera of Busha is really like the Chasam Sefer, you matriach him, and on his level, you can't do that to the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So I don't know, I find this very moving. This is like a typical thing, how Torah Bavi works. He's just got a couple of lines over here. I want to finish off this presentation and see if I can say one bar in Malacha Gerua before we run out of time. I just want to say one more thing over here. I want to say there's a Gemara in Chulin, Kuf Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda said the following statements. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Remember who the players are over here. In Eretz Yisrael, you had Rabbi Yehuda and Rish Lakish. In Bavel, we had Rav and Shmuel. These are the 4 Tanaim that were the first generation of the Amoraim. No one could compete with them. So Rabbi Yehuda says, when I was sitting in the Beis Hamedrash of Rav Yehuda Hanasi. So how do they teach in those days? It's not exactly Latin learning, okay? No offense, Nati, okay? But it's not exactly a bunch of NCSY teenagers. Every place that you sat was a symbol of your standing over there. Today, we would not go for these things. We're entering soon into the Biden era, Chas v'shalom, and that's it. That no one covered, no concept of covered, no concept of malchus, no concept of any form of stolz. And you have over here, everyone has their place. Everyone has their makom. He says, Rabbi Yochanan was on the 17th row. And Rav, he sits in front of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He was that big. He was a front row person. He says, when they had conversations, this is how the conversations went. Listen to this. This is a Gemara in Chulin, Kuf Lamed Zayin. I'm not calling any Zohar over here. He says, V'nafke skukim denura mipume derav lepume derebi. Fire, sparks of fire, he says, came out of the mouth of Rav and entered into the mouth of Rav Yehuda Hanasi. And then he says, umipume derebi lepume Rav. And then Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would talk back, and the fire would come out and go back into the mouth of Rabbi. He says, the less ana yada mahi maimrim. I couldn't understand what was going on. Rabbi Yehuda couldn't understand the conversations. Now, I wish that Ramesh Shapiro was alive. I wish I could be driving him this afternoon and ask him, what does a conversation in fire mean? I don't even know how to translate the words. I know, okay, we all know the Gemara in Kedushin, that Torah is compared to fire. But one thing I do understand is that Rav and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had a special relationship, which is built on passing over the Messiah from the Tkufa of the Tanaim into the Tkufa of the Amoraim, from the 2,000 years of Torah, which the